Ethan had always been drawn to the solitude of nature, finding comfort in the isolation of deep, untouched forests. But this place was different. As he ventured deeper into the woods, the air began to feel heavy, oppressive, as if something unseen was pressing down on him. The trees grew taller, their twisted branches interlocking above his head, creating a canopy that blocked out the sun. A creeping fog began to rise from the forest floor, curling around his ankles like tendrils of smoke. The deeper he went, the quieter it became, until even the sound of his footsteps seemed muffled, swallowed by the unnatural silence. Suddenly, Ethan stumbled upon a clearing, but it wasn't an ordinary clearing. The trees around it were strange, their bark glistening with an eerie sheen, reflecting the dim light in ways that defied explanation. At first, he thought it was water, but as he stepped closer, he realized it was something far more sinister. The surfaces of the trees shimmered like polished glass, reflecting his own image back at him. But there was something wrong. His reflection didn't move in sync with him. It lagged behind, just a second too late, its eyes not quite matching his. A chill ran down his spine as he stared at it, unable to look away, feeling a growing sense of unease twist in his gut. The clearing itself seemed to pulse with a strange energy, and the ground beneath his feet felt unnervingly soft, like walking on layers of damp, rotting leaves. But the real horror lay in the reflections. Each time he glanced at the reflective surfaces, something different stared back at him. His face was distorted, elongated, as though the mirrors were bending reality itself. He could feel his heart racing, his breathing becoming shallow. He tried to turn back, but the path he had come from was no longer there. The forest had shifted, closing in on him like a trap. A whisper of wind brushed past his ear, carrying with it a sound that made his blood run cold. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably human. A voice, distorted and warped, echoing from the reflections around him. It was speaking his name, softly at first, then louder, more insistent. His skin prickled with fear, and for the first time in his life, Ethan felt truly lost. He spun around, searching for the source, but all he saw were endless reflections of himself, twisted and wrong. The reflections were watching him now, their eyes following his every move, and in one of them, he swore he saw a figure standing behind him. Panic set in. He turned quickly, but no one was there. Yet, in the reflections, the figure remained, growing closer with each glance. It was tall, its face obscured by shadow, but its presence was suffocating. Ethan could feel it, a malevolent force that seemed to seep into his very bones. The reflections around him distorted further, becoming a chaotic kaleidoscope of nightmares, with images of his own face melting and twisting into grotesque forms. The forest, once still, now felt alive with something ancient, something evil. His pulse pounded in his ears as the fog thickened, rising higher, obscuring the ground beneath him. His feet felt glued to the spot, as if the earth itself was trying to swallow him whole. Every rational thought screamed at him to run, to escape, but his body refused to move. The oppressive atmosphere weighed down on him, crushing his chest, making it difficult to breathe. In the reflection, the figure reached out, its long, shadowy fingers stretching toward him, and for a moment, he thought he could feel its cold touch on the back of his neck. That was when Ethan realized the horrifying truth. This place was not just reflecting him, it was watching him. The forest of mirrors had eyes, and it was hungry. As Ethan stood frozen in the clearing, struggling to process the eerie reflections and the suffocating presence behind him, a flicker of movement in one of the mirrored surfaces caught his eye. It wasn't just another distorted image of himself. No, it was something familiar, yet long buried in his memory. Among the warped reflections, there it was, a small, rusted tricycle, its red paint chipped and peeling, sitting in the shadows at the edge of the clearing. His heart skipped a beat. That tricycle, it was impossible. Ethan's mind raced back to a day long ago, a day he had worked so hard to forget. He and his younger brother, Sam, had played near a lake not far from where Ethan stood now. Sam had been riding that very tricycle, laughing, carefree, when he vanished. One moment he was there, pedaling joyfully along the water's edge, and the next he was gone, without a trace, as if the earth had swallowed him whole. They searched for days, but Sam was never found. His disappearance haunted Ethan's childhood, a shadow that clung to him even as he grew older, though he had locked those memories away deep inside. Yet now, in the heart of this twisted, reflective forest, the tricycle had returned, impossibly intact, as though the forest had plucked it from the past and placed it here, waiting for him. His hands trembled as he took a hesitant step closer, eyes wide with disbelief. The fog around him seemed to pulse in time with his rapid heartbeat, growing thicker, colder, as the tricycle gleamed ominously in the dim light. He knelt beside it, his fingers brushing the rusted metal, and a sharp chill ran through him, as if the object itself was alive, humming with the weight of forgotten memories. Then, from the depths of his mind, something stirred, an image, half-formed but persistent. A mirror. Ethan remembered, now with painful clarity, the day after Sam's disappearance. He had found a broken mirror near the lake, its surface cracked in a spiderweb of fractures. At the time, it had seemed a trivial, strange coincidence, a meaningless fragment in the chaos of losing his brother. But now, in this cursed place, surrounded by mirrors that twisted reality, that memory took on a new, horrifying significance. What if Sam hadn't just vanished? What if the mirrors had taken him? As the thoughts settled in his mind, a low, guttural sound echoed through the clearing, like the groan of something ancient and unseen shifting beneath the earth. Ethan's breath hitched, and he looked around, the fog swirling thickly around his ankles, obscuring the ground. In the reflections, his own image flickered and warped, but behind it, always lingering just out of reach, was that same shadowed figure. It was closer now, almost tangible, a dark specter watching him from the mirrored surfaces, as if it knew him, knew his past, his deepest fears. A soft, childlike laugh broke the silence, chilling Ethan to his core. He whipped his head around, but no one was there. The laugh echoed again, distant but unmistakable, and Ethan's blood ran cold. It was Sam's laugh, exactly as he remembered it from that terrible day. He spun back toward the tricycle, but now, in the reflection of the mirror-like trees, he saw a pair of small, shadowed feet standing beside it. His stomach lurched as the realization hit him like a punch. The forest wasn't just showing him memories, it was bringing them to life. Suddenly, the world around him seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, the very air vibrating with something dark and ancient. The tricycle creaked, moving ever so slightly, as if nudged by an unseen hand. Ethan staggered back, his mind reeling. How could this be happening? What was this place? His thoughts were a blur of terror and confusion, but one thing was clear. The forest wasn't just playing tricks on him. It was trying to draw him deeper, pulling at the threads of his past, unraveling his sanity one memory at a time. A faint melody drifted through the air, barely audible at first, but growing clearer with each passing second. It was a lullaby, one that his mother used to sing to both him and Sam when they were children. The haunting tune sent a shiver down Ethan's spine, filling the air with an eerie nostalgia that felt both comforting and wrong. As the lullaby echoed through the clearing, the reflections around him began to change. In every mirrored surface, he saw not himself, but glimpses of his childhood, fleeting images of him and Sam playing, laughing, unaware of the horrors that lay ahead. But the images twisted and darkened, the laughter warping into distorted, nightmarish echoes. Ethan stumbled backward, panic rising in his chest. He had to get out of here, had to escape this place before it consumed him completely. Yet no matter which direction he turned, the reflections continued to mock him, showing not just his past, but his deepest fears. And always, lurking in the corners of those mirrors, was the shadowed figure, watching, waiting. The lullaby faded, leaving behind only silence and the oppressive weight of the forest. Ethan's mind raced as he realized the truth. This place, this forest of mirrors, was feeding on his forgotten past. It had dredged up his darkest memory, the day his brother disappeared, and now it was twisting that memory into something monstrous. But what did it want from him? And more terrifyingly, what had really happened to Sam all those years ago? Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears as the haunting echoes of the lullaby faded into the thick fog around him. The forest, now fully alive with his darkest memories, seemed to press in on all sides. He stumbled away from the tricycle, feeling the weight of the past drag him down, suffocating his thoughts. Every reflection around him flickered with distorted versions of himself, of Sam, and of a shadowed figure that now felt like a predator, lurking just out of sight. His mind was racing, trying to piece together a way out, but there was no clear path. Then, from the depths of the fog, a voice called his name. It was low, distorted, and eerily familiar, as if the forest itself had found its voice. Ethan, the whisper seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. His breath hitched as he spun around, searching for the source, but all he saw were those endless mirrors, reflecting him, taunting him. But then, in one of the reflections, something changed. The fog in the mirror parted, revealing an image that froze him in place. His younger brother, Sam, standing in the same clearing, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. Sam reached out toward Ethan, silently pleading for help, but his mouth moved with no sound. Ethan's heart clenched. His brother had been gone for years, lost to the mysteries of the lake and the memories Ethan had tried so hard to bury. But now he was here, or at least, something that looked like him was here. Ethan staggered closer to the reflection, hope and dread warring inside him. Could it really be Sam? Or was this another twisted trick of the forest? Before he could decide, the shadowed figure emerged from the fog, its presence heavier than before. It stood behind Sam in the reflection, towering over him like a dark sentinel. Its face was still obscured, a mass of darkness that defied recognition, but its intent was clear. The figure lifted one hand, long and gnarled, pointing directly at Ethan. In his mind, he heard the voice again, this time more forceful, resonating in the depths of his thoughts. You can save him. The words hung in the air, echoing through Ethan's mind like a haunting chant. He felt a shiver of cold dread slither down his spine. Save Sam. How? His brother had been gone for so long. But the figure stepped closer to the edge of the reflection, and suddenly, a path appeared before Ethan. A path that led deeper into the forest, toward the heart of the mirrored nightmare. The figure's voice came again, colder this time, with an offer that sent ice through Ethan's veins. You can save him, but you must sacrifice a part of yourself. Ethan stood frozen, torn between the desperate need to save his brother and the terrifying realization of what it might cost. The air around him seemed to thicken with an ancient, malevolent energy, pressing down on him like a weight too heavy to bear. The voice continued, its tones seductive, almost coaxing. Your memories, your mind, one will be the price. Choose, or he is lost forever. A terrible understanding dawned on Ethan. The forest was offering him a deal, an impossible choice. If he wanted to save Sam, if he wanted to finally bring closure to the tragedy that had haunted him all these years, he had to give up something precious. His memories, his sanity. He could already feel the strain on his mind, the way the forest had twisted his perception of reality, bending his thoughts and warping his past. If he chose to give up his memories, would he even remember Sam by the end? Would he remember himself? The alternative was no better. The thought of giving up his sanity, allowing the darkness to seep into his mind, was unbearable. What would happen to him then? Would he become just another shadow, wandering lost in the endless maze of reflections, forgotten by the world outside? And what if this was all just a cruel trick? What if Sam wasn't real, and the forest was simply feeding on his desperation? But the image of his brother, standing there in the mirror, his eyes filled with silent fear, pulled at Ethan's heart. How could he abandon him again? He had failed to protect him once before. Could he really live with himself if he walked away now? The voice in his mind grew more insistent, the figure's outstretched hand seeming to beckon him closer. The reflections around him began to blur, the forest's grip tightening. The path before him shimmered, a twisted corridor of glass and fog, leading into the heart of the unknown. Ethan's thoughts spiraled in turmoil. He looked at his reflection, his face pale, eyes wide with terror, and then back at the image of Sam. The boy in the reflection looked so real, so vulnerable. Could he really risk it all to save him? And yet, wasn't that what brothers were supposed to do? His mind screamed at him to run, to flee from this madness, but his heart was pulling him in the opposite direction. Finally, with a trembling hand, Ethan reached out toward the reflection, toward the shadowed figure's offer. His voice was barely a whisper, shaky and broken. What? What do you want from me?" The figure's hand, long and twisted, hovered closer to Ethan's face in the reflection, almost as if it could reach through the glass and pull him in. "Sacrifice," the voice hissed. "Give me your mind, and he will live." Ethan's vision blurred, and he could feel the cold, dark tendrils of the forest wrapping around his consciousness, pulling at the edges of his sanity. The shadows seemed to pulse with anticipation, waiting for him to make the impossible choice. With a heavy heart, Ethan closed his eyes, his mind filled with a whirlwind of fear, regret, and the haunting image of his lost brother. The forest waited, silent and still, as Ethan stood at the crossroads of his fate, the weight of impossible decision pressing down on him like a vice. We sacrifice his memories, his sanity, or everything he had ever known, for a chance, just a chance, to save Sam. Ethan stood at the edge of the mirrored path, his hand trembling as he pulled back from the reflection of his brother and the shadowed figure. The forest around him had grown unnervingly quiet, as if holding its breath, waiting for his next move. The once still air felt thick with an unseen presence, like the weight of 100 unseen eyes watching him, waiting for him to falter. Every breath he took was shallow, the cold fog creeping around his feet like tendrils of something alive, something aware. The silence was suffocating, yet in that oppressive quiet, something stirred. It started as a faint whisper, barely audible, like the sound of wind brushing through the trees. But Ethan knew it wasn't the wind. There was no breeze in this suffocating place. The whisper grew louder, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once, seeping into his ears and burrowing into his mind. The voice was fragmented, shifting between soft murmurs and sharp hisses, as though multiple voices were speaking at once, overlapping in a dissonant chorus. Ethan strained to make out the words, but they were twisted, distorted, like they were being spoken through a veil between worlds. His pulse quickened as the whispers grew more distinct, swirling around him in a circle, their source invisible, their intent sinister. The air around him felt charged with dark energy, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He turned slowly, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was hiding in the shadows, but there was nothing, only the endless reflections of himself, staring back with a growing sense of dread. Yet in each reflection, there was a subtle movement, something flickering just at the edge of his vision. The figures in the mirrors seemed to shift when he wasn't looking, their faces twisted into expressions of fear and madness. The whisper came again, this time clearer, and Ethan's blood ran cold. It wasn't just random noise. It was his name, being repeated over and over, spoken in a voice that was both familiar and alien. Ethan. The sound of his name, being called from the shadows, was enough to send a shiver down his spine. It wasn't just one voice, but many, some soft and pleading, others harsh and commanding. They were calling to him, urging him to move deeper into the heart of the forest, to follow the path laid out before him. He tried to block out the whispers, but they only grew louder, more insistent. "Come, follow, you can't leave." His mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The voices seemed to pull at his very soul, tugging him toward the center of the forest, where the shadows were darkest and the reflections most distorted. The sensation of being watched intensified, and though he couldn't see anything in the darkness, he could feel it. Something was there, lurking just beyond the edge of sight, waiting. The trees around him, their surfaces still gleaming like mirrors, began to pulse with a dull, rhythmic glow, as if they were alive, breathing in unison with the whispers. Ethan's heart raced as the forest itself seemed to close in on him, the fog growing thicker, the light dimming. Shadows flickered and danced at the edges of his vision, and in the mirrors, his reflection began to move on its own, shifting unnaturally, as though it were no longer tethered to his actions. His reflection's eyes gleamed with something dark, something ancient, and for the first time, Ethan felt truly disconnected from himself, as though the forest had begun to peel away his sense of reality. Then, through the cacophony of whispers, a single voice cut through, clear and sharp. It was the voice of his brother, Sam. "Ethan, help me." The sound of Sam's voice was distant, like an echo from a place far beyond the clearing, but unmistakable. Ethan's heart clenched, torn between disbelief and the desperate hope that his brother might still be alive. But how could that be? Sam had been gone for years, lost in a tragedy that had shattered Ethan's world. And yet, here in this twisted place, his voice was real, beckoning him, pleading for him to follow. The whispering voices seemed to retreat for a moment, as if giving space for Sam's voice to echo through the forest. "Ethan, I'm trapped. You have to find me." The voice was fragile, broken, as though it came from someone barely holding on to life. It tugged at Ethan's heartstrings, filling him with a mix of terror and overwhelming guilt. He had failed to save his brother once. Could he really abandon him again? But the deeper fear was gnawing at the back of his mind. What if this wasn't Sam? What if the forest was using his brother's voice to lure him further into its twisted trap? A cold sweat broke out across Ethan's skin as the shadows around him began to writhe, taking on shapes that were almost human. They slithered along the edges of the clearing, faceless figures made of darkness and mist, their forms flickering in and out of existence like living nightmares. The reflections in the mirrors mimicked these movements, their distorted images growing more grotesque with each passing second. Ethan's hands trembled as he felt the ground beneath him shift, as though the very earth was alive, breathing with the same dark energy that pulsed through the forest. The whispers surged again, louder and more chaotic, overlapping with Sam's voice until it was impossible to tell one from the other. "Save me. You can't leave. Join us forever." The voices became a maddening cacophony, drilling into Ethan's mind, fraying the edges of his sanity. He pressed his hands to his ears, trying to block them out, but the voices were inside him now, burrowing deep into his thoughts, his memories, his fears. Suddenly, the shadows in the mirrors began to take form, twisting into ghastly versions of himself, warped, grotesque figures with hollow eyes and twisted smiles. They reached out toward him, their hands pressing against the surface of the mirrors as if trying to break free. Ethan staggered back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The reflections seemed to mock him, their movements erratic, as if they were no longer bound by his actions. One of them, the nearest, began to smile, wide, unnatural, as if its face was being pulled apart by an invisible force. And then it spoke. "You'll never leave." Ethan's stomach dropped as he realized the truth. This place wasn't just watching him. It was consuming him, piece by piece, drawing him into its twisted reality. The forest of mirrors wasn't just a place. It was a living, breathing entity, and he was trapped within its grasp. The whisper in the shadows had become a roar, a maddening, relentless force that threatened to tear him apart. Ethan's mind was unraveling. The forest had become a living nightmare, an endless maze of mirrors and shadows that twisted reality at every turn. His breathing was shallow, ragged, and his heart hammered in his chest as the whispers from the shadows grew louder, more insistent, clawing at the edges of his sanity. The ground beneath him seemed to pulse, as though the forest itself was alive, breathing with malevolent intent. Every step he took was fraught with danger, as though the very act of moving would trigger something unspeakable that waited just beyond his sight. The reflections around him had become distorted caricatures of himself, their faces twisted into grotesque masks of fear and madness. His own eyes stared back at him, but they were not his eyes anymore. They were hollow, dark, filled with a terror that Ethan was only beginning to comprehend. As he moved, the reflections seemed to shift on their own, moving out of sync with his body, mocking his every action. The sensation of being watched, closely, intimately, was overwhelming, as if the forest was feeding on his fear, drawing strength from his unraveling mind. Then, the forest began to play tricks on him. Ethan stumbled through the fog, his thoughts disjointed, when a vision appeared ahead of him. It was his childhood home, standing impossibly in the middle of the forest. He froze, his heart leaping into his throat. The house was as he remembered, small, weathered, with the familiar creak of the front door barely hanging on its hinges. It was an anchor to a life he had lost, a place where he had once felt safe. But now, standing here in the heart of this twisted forest, the sight of it filled him with dread. He knew it wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Yet the temptation to step inside, to seek refuge from the madness outside, gnawed at him. What if it was real? What if this house, this illusion, could offer him a moment of peace, a brief reprieve from the terror that had consumed his every thought? The whispers in the forest shifted, as though sensing his hesitation, and a soft voice, his mother's voice, called out from within the house. "Ethan, come home." His breath caught in his throat. The sound of his mother's voice, so gentle, so warm, broke through the wall of fear that had been suffocating him. He hadn't heard that voice in years, not since her death. But here it was, in the middle of this nightmare, beckoning him back, offering him solace. Ethan took a step toward the house, his mind clouded with a deep, aching longing. His feet moved on their own, pulling him closer, and with each step, the house seemed to grow more real, more tangible. The smell of home, a mix of wood smoke and fresh linen, filled his nostrils, and for a moment, he was a child again, safe and sound. But then, the vision faltered. Just for a split second, the house flickered, its image distorting, and in its place, Ethan caught a glimpse of something else, something dark, twisted, and wrong. The familiar scent turned rancid, like decaying leaves and damp rot. He stopped, his heart racing, as the comforting facade of his childhood home began to melt away, revealing the truth beneath the illusion. The house was a trap, a baited lure to draw him deeper into the forest's web. And beyond the house, in the shadows, he saw them. Eyes. Dozens of eyes, watching, waiting. The whispers surged again, more urgent now, and the visions became worse. The ground beneath him shifted, and suddenly, the fog parted to reveal a horrifying scene. His brother, Sam, standing in the middle of the clearing, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. But something was wrong. Sam's figure flickered, his body twitching unnaturally, as though he were a puppet being manipulated by invisible strings. His voice was broken, distorted, as he called out, "Ethan, help me." Ethan's blood ran cold. The forest was using his deepest fears against him, weaving them into the very fabric of his reality. His mind was teetering on the edge, caught between the overwhelming desire to save his brother and the terrifying realization that none of this could be trusted. His vision blurred, the shadows around him warping and twisting, and the whispers from the forest became deafening. They were no longer just voices. They were his thoughts, his fears, amplified and distorted, echoing through his mind like a never-ending nightmare. In the reflection of the mirrors around him, Ethan began to see things that weren't there, things that couldn't be real. His own face, gaunt and hollow, stared back at him, its mouth twisted into a silent scream. Behind him, the shadowy figure loomed closer, its presence like a weight pressing down on his chest, suffocating him. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to escape, but the forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, its mirrored surfaces reflecting his every move, trapping him in an endless loop of fear. And then the visions became worse. In the reflections, Ethan saw not only himself, but his darkest fears made manifest. His body, broken and twisted, lying motionless on the ground, his face frozen in an expression of pure terror. His brother, lost forever, swallowed by the shadows. And worst of all, Ethan saw the reflection of a man who was no longer himself, his eyes empty, his mind shattered, lost to the forest's madness. The fear was overwhelming. It clawed at him, twisting his perception, making him question what was real and what was illusion. He could feel the forest pulling at him, tugging at the edges of his mind, tempting him to give in, to let go. The temptation to surrender to the fear, to let it consume him, was almost unbearable. What was the point of fighting? The forest was alive. It knew his deepest fears, and it would never let him go. But even as the shadows pressed in, as the reflections mocked him and the whispers echoed in his mind, Ethan clung to one thought, one fragile thread of hope. If this place could twist reality, if it could turn his fears against him, then maybe, just maybe, he could fight back. But how? The forest was relentless, its dark power far beyond anything he could comprehend. Still, Ethan knew that if he gave in now, if he let the fear consume him, he would be lost forever, just another shadow in the forest's twisted maze. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, Ethan took a deep breath, steadying his mind against the barrage of horrors. The temptation of fear was strong, but he couldn't let it win. He had to keep moving, keep searching for a way out. Even if the forest had him trapped in a nightmare, even if everything he saw was a lie, he couldn't stop. Not yet. The forest might know his fears, but it hadn't taken his will. Not yet. The air in the forest had grown impossibly still, as if the entire world had paused, waiting for Ethan to take his next breath. The weight of the fear he had been carrying crushed down on him, but now, standing at the edge of madness, he could feel the approach of something far worse. The forest of mirrors was no longer content with playing tricks on his mind. It was closing in, preparing to reveal its darkest secret. The whispers around him had shifted, becoming more guttural, less human, like the growls of an ancient beast stirring in the shadows. Ethan stood frozen in the middle of the clearing, his eyes darting from reflection to reflection. The mirrored trees glistened with an eerie light, distorting his image into something grotesque and unfamiliar. His face in the reflections was no longer his own, twisted by fear and exhaustion, staring back at him with hollow eyes that seemed to accuse him of something he didn't understand. But it wasn't the reflections that held his attention. It was the figure in the distance, barely visible through the fog. The same shadowed figure that had been stalking him from the beginning, lingering at the edge of his vision, was now fully visible. The figure was tall, impossibly so, with elongated limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally as it moved closer. Its face, if it had one, was hidden behind a veil of shifting shadows, but there was no mistaking the malevolent presence that radiated from it. Ethan's heart raced as the figure slowly approached, the air growing colder with every step it took. This was it, the thing that had been watching him, tormenting him, pulling him deeper into the forest's nightmare. And now, it was ready to reveal itself. The fog around the figure parted, and Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just a shadow, it was a reflection. The creature was made of mirrors, its body shimmering like broken glass, reflecting Ethan's image back at him in 1,000 fractured pieces. Each piece showed a different version of him, some twisted in agony, others staring blankly into nothingness. It was as if the forest had taken every fear, every regret, every moment of pain, and woven it into this monstrous form. And now, that form was coming for him. Ethan backed away, but there was nowhere to run. The reflections in the trees distorted further, their twisted versions of him laughing, crying, screaming silently as the shadowed figure drew nearer. His mind was a whirlwind of terror and confusion, and for a moment, he thought about giving in, about letting the forest take him. But something deep inside him pushed back, a flicker of defiance that refused to let the darkness win. He had come too far, faced too much. There had to be a way out of this nightmare. The figure stopped just a few feet away from Ethan, its form towering over him like a specter of death. The mirrors on its body shifted, and Ethan saw something that made his blood run cold. Reflected in the creature's shimmering surface was not just his own image, but the image of his brother, Sam. The boy's face was pale, his eyes wide with terror, staring out from the mirrored prison as if begging for help. Ethan's heart clenched with guilt and desperation. This creature had taken Sam, had trapped him here, in this forest of endless reflections. And now, it wanted Ethan too? A voice, low and guttural, rumbled from the figure's shadowed form, filling the air with a sound that made Ethan's skin crawl. You failed him, just as you will fail yourself. The words struck deep, like a knife twisting in his gut. The guilt that had haunted him for years came rushing back with a vengeance. He had failed to save his brother when they were children, and now, it seemed, the forest was giving him one final chance. But at what cost? Ethan's mind raced, torn between the overwhelming fear that threatened to consume him and the desperate need to save Sam. The creature loomed closer, its mirrored surface reflecting more images of his brother, images of him trapped, crying, reaching out for help. Save him, the voice hissed, and take his place. You can free him, but you must stay. The horror of the choice sank in. Ethan could save his brother, could finally bring an end to the guilt and the nightmares, but it would cost him his freedom. He would be trapped here, in this place, forever. The forest of mirrors would claim him, just as it had claimed Sam. He would become one of the reflections, lost in the endless labyrinth of distorted images, while his brother would walk free. The temptation was unbearable. He had spent so long searching for answers, for a way to atone for his failure. But was this the answer? The figure moved even closer, its cold, mirrored hand reaching out toward Ethan. The air around him seemed to freeze, the fog turning to frost as the creature's fingers brushed against his skin. In that moment, Ethan felt the pull of the forest, the seductive lure of giving in, of letting go. It would be so easy. The fear, the pain, the guilt. It could all end here, if he just surrendered. The forest was offering him an escape, a way to erase the past and make things right. But deep down, Ethan knew it was a lie. The forest wasn't offering salvation. It was offering damnation. If he gave in, if he let the fear consume him, he would lose everything. His brother would be free, but Ethan would be lost, just another shadow in the mirrors, forgotten by the world. And the forest would win. With a surge of determination, Ethan pulled back, wrenching himself free from the creature's cold grip. The figure recoiled, its mirrored surface flickering with dark energy, and for the first time, Ethan saw something that gave him hope: fear. The creature, this thing that had been tormenting him, feeding on his fear, was afraid. It wasn't invincible. It could be fought. Ethan took a deep breath, steadying himself as the creature lashed out, its long, twisted limbs flailing in rage. The reflections around him warped and twisted, showing images of his own death, of Sam lost forever. But Ethan pushed them aside. He had made his choice. He wasn't going to let the forest take him. Not today. The creature lunged, its mirrored body shimmering with a terrible, blinding light. But Ethan stood his ground. He reached out, his hand brushing against the cold, reflective surface. And in that moment, something shifted. The mirrors cracked, spiderwebbing out from the point of contact, and the creature let out a howl of rage and pain. The reflections around him shattered, the images of his brother and himself fracturing into 1,000 pieces. The forest trembled, the ground shaking beneath Ethan's feet as the creature's form began to dissolve, its body collapsing into a pool of broken glass and shadow. The whispers in the trees faded, replaced by a deafening silence. Ethan stood alone in the clearing, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his mind reeling from what he had just done. But as the fog lifted and the forest returned to its unnatural stillness, Ethan realized something. The mirrors were gone. The twisted reflections, the distorted images, they had all disappeared, leaving behind only the cold, empty trees. And in the distance, just beyond the edge of the clearing, he saw a figure, a small, familiar figure. It was Sam. His brother stood there, watching him, his face no longer pale with fear, but filled with relief. Ethan's heart swelled with emotion, a tear slipping down his cheek as he took a step toward him. But then, just as quickly as the figure appeared, it was gone, vanishing into the mist, leaving Ethan alone once more. The moment of truth had passed. He had faced the forest, the darkness within himself, and he had survived. But as he stood in the silence, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't done with him yet. The silence that followed Sam's vanishing form was heavy and oppressive, wrapping around Ethan like a suffocating blanket. His breath hung in the cold air, each exhale a reminder of the thin line between life and the abyss he had just walked. The forest was still, too still. No more whispers, no more shifting shadows. But Ethan knew better than to trust the calm. This place had a pulse, a will of its own, and it wasn't finished with him yet. The mirrored forest may have retreated for the moment, but the presence, the ancient, malevolent force, remained. He could feel it, lurking just beyond the veil of fog that clung to the trees like rotting flesh. Ethan took a tentative step forward, the ground beneath him crunching underfoot, but the sound seemed to echo unnaturally in the vast emptiness. His mind raced, replaying the images of his brother's terrified face, the twisted reflections of himself, and the monster made of mirrors. A cold dread crept into his bones as he realized what was coming. The forest had offered him a choice, his brother's freedom in exchange for his own, and he had refused. Now it wanted retribution. The air around him grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly as frost began to form on the trees, their bark cracking under the sudden change. Ethan's breath came out in ragged gasps, each one visible as a cloud of mist in the freezing air. And then he heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate the very ground beneath him. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere, a sound that resonated deep within his chest, shaking him to his core. The fog thickened, swirling like a living thing, and Ethan felt a presence looming closer, an immense force gathering just beyond his sight. The growl grew louder, more aggressive, as the ground beneath his feet began to tremble. Then, from the mist, it emerged. The creature, the forest's true face, was unlike anything Ethan had ever imagined. It was no longer just a figure made of mirrors. It had evolved into something far more monstrous, a grotesque amalgamation of shadows and glass, with jagged limbs that seemed to stretch infinitely into the dark sky. Its body was a mass of shifting reflections, each one capturing a twisted version of Ethan's life, moments of fear, regret, and pain. Faces swirled within its form, his mother, his brother, himself, all distorted, all screaming silently for release. The creature's eyes, if they could be called that, were hollow, empty voids that seemed to suck in all the light, and yet they glowed with a deep, burning hatred, locking onto Ethan with an intensity that froze him in place. It moved slowly, deliberately, as though savoring the terror it invoked. Each step it took caused the ground to fracture, shards of glass rising from the earth like broken teeth, shimmering in the dim light. Ethan could barely breathe. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to run, to escape this nightmare, but his legs wouldn't move. The weight of the creature's presence was too much, pressing down on him like an invisible hand, squeezing the air from his lungs. The creature stopped, towering over him, its massive form blotting out the sky. Ethan could feel its cold breath against his skin, like shards of ice cutting into him. The air crackled with malevolent energy, and the reflections within the creature's body began to shift again, showing Ethan images of his darkest moments, the ones he had fought so hard to forget. His brother's disappearance, the night his mother had died, calling out for help that never came. His own failures, his regrets, his fears, all played out in front of him, inescapable, undeniable. "You cannot escape," the creature's voice rumbled, low and deep, like the grinding of stone. "You belong to me." The words hit Ethan like a blow, and for a moment, he felt the crushing weight of hopelessness settle over him. The forest had been playing with him from the start, feeding on his fears, his guilt, his sorrow. It had no intention of letting him leave. This was its purpose: to consume him, to trap him in an endless cycle of torment, just as it had done to so many before him. But even as the creature's voice echoed in his mind, Ethan felt a spark of defiance ignite deep within him. He had come too far, faced too many horrors, to simply give in now. His brother, Sam, was still out there, still waiting for him to bring him home. The forest might be powerful, but it wasn't invincible. It fed on fear, on submission, but Ethan had something left. He had hope, however small, and he wasn't ready to let that go. Summoning every last ounce of strength, Ethan forced his body to move, to stand tall before the monstrous figure. His heart pounded in his chest, the blood rushing in his ears, but he held his ground. The creature's hollow eyes flared with anger, its body trembling with dark energy, as if it sensed his resolve. "You don't control me," Ethan said, his voice hoarse but steady. "You never did." The creature let out a roar, a sound so deep and violent that the very air seemed to shatter. It lunged at Ethan, its jagged limbs slicing through the air. But this time, Ethan didn't flinch. He reached out, his hand brushing against the creature's shimmering surface, and with a surge of determination, he pushed back. The mirrors cracked beneath his touch, splintering with a deafening sound that echoed through the forest. The creature recoiled, its form flickering wildly, as the cracks spread across its body like a web of shattered glass. The reflections within it began to break apart, fragmenting into 1,000 pieces as the forest itself seemed to tremble. Ethan pressed forward, his mind focused on one thing: destroying this nightmare, ending the terror once and for all. With a final, desperate push, Ethan slammed his hand into the creature's chest, and the world exploded into light. The mirror shattered, the reflection splintering into nothingness, and the creature let out a final, agonized scream as it disintegrated into the air, vanishing into the void. The forest around him fell silent. The fog lifted, the trees stood still, and the oppressive weight that had pressed down on him was gone. Ethan stood alone in the clearing, the broken shards of the creature's form scattered around him, glinting in the pale light. He had won. The forest had lost its hold on him, its dark power shattered. But as the silence settled over the clearing, Ethan knew that the battle had come at a cost. He had faced the darkness within himself, and though he had survived, he was changed. As he turned to leave, Ethan glanced back at the shattered remnants of the creature. The mirrors were broken, but in their fractured surface, he could still see the faint reflection of his brother. Just a flicker, a shadow. Sam was free, but the mystery of the forest remained. Ethan walked through the now silent forest, his footsteps echoing in the eerie stillness. The oppressive fog that had once suffocated him had lifted, revealing a landscape that was strangely peaceful, almost serene. But there was no relief in this calm, only a hollow silence that weighed on his mind like a distant, lingering threat. The forest might have retreated, but its presence was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. He had survived the confrontation, but as Ethan moved through the trees, he couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was not done with him yet. The broken shards of the creature he had destroyed lay scattered around him, glinting faintly in the pale light. The reflections within them had vanished, but the shards still hummed with a quiet, unsettling energy. As Ethan stepped over them, he caught glimpses of distorted images in the fragments, fleeting shapes that disappeared the moment he tried to focus on them. Faces, shadows, eyes, just on the edge of perception, like ghosts trapped in the remnants of the forest's power. It was as though the shattered mirrors still held pieces of the forest's twisted reality, fragments of the nightmare that had yet to fully fade. His thoughts returned to Sam, his brother, whose image had haunted him throughout the ordeal. He had seen Sam in the reflections, heard his voice, and even felt his presence. But now that the forest's hold was broken, Sam was gone, vanished into the mist like a fading memory. Ethan couldn't be sure if what he had seen was real or just another cruel trick of the forest. Had Sam truly been there, trapped all this time, or had it been the forest manipulating his deepest fears to lure him further into the darkness? Ethan stopped walking, his mind swirling with uncertainty. He had come here searching for answers, desperate to find closure for the tragedy that had torn his family apart. But the forest had only given him more questions, questions that he wasn't sure he wanted to face. The silence around him pressed in, and for a moment he wondered if he was still trapped in the forest's web. The terror of that thought gripped him tightly, sending a shiver down his spine. What if none of this was real? What if the forest had never let him go? He glanced back over his shoulder, half expecting to see the fog creeping back in, the twisted reflections returning. But the forest remained still, eerily quiet, the trees casting long shadows in the dim light. It was over. At least, that's what he told himself. But the nagging doubt in his mind refused to let go. Something about this place, about the Forest of Mirrors, felt timeless, eternal, as if its power could never truly be destroyed, only momentarily subdued. The deeper Ethan ventured into the quiet woods, the more he became aware of how unchanged everything looked. The trees still loomed tall and foreboding, their bark slick with the faint sheen of glass. The path ahead was winding, endless, as if the forest stretched on forever. No matter how far he walked, it felt as though he was moving in circles, trapped in a loop he couldn't escape. The sense of disorientation grew stronger with every step, the silence growing more oppressive, like a void that threatened to swallow him whole. And then, just as he was beginning to lose hope, he saw it. Something out of place in the endless sea of trees. A small clearing, bathed in an ethereal light that seemed to emanate from nowhere. In the center of the clearing stood a single, unbroken mirror. It was tall and ancient, its surface gleaming with a pristine clarity that was unsettling in its perfection. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He had seen enough mirrors in this cursed place to know that they were never just mirrors. They were gateways, prisons, or worse, windows into something far darker. Cautiously, Ethan approached the mirror, his heart pounding in his chest. The closer he got, the more the air around him seemed to thicken, becoming heavy with an unseen presence. His reflection stared back at him, but there was something off. Something in the way the eyes of his reflection seemed to follow him, unblinking, too aware. He stopped a few feet from the mirror, his entire body tense, every instinct screaming at him to turn away, to run. But he couldn't. He had to know. He had to see. The air around the mirror shimmered, and for a brief moment, Ethan thought he saw something moving within the reflection. It wasn't his own image. It was something behind him, lurking just out of sight. A shadow, indistinct but unmistakably there. His blood ran cold as he turned slowly, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, only the empty forest, silent and still. He turned back to the mirror, and that's when he saw it. His reflection was no longer his own. The face staring back at him was twisted, distorted, its eyes hollow and dark. It was the same face he had seen in the creature's mirrored body, the same face that had haunted him in the reflections throughout the forest. The face of a man who had lost everything, consumed by fear and madness. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he took a step back, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. And then the reflection spoke. "You didn't think it was over, did you?" The voice was his own, but it was wrong, twisted with malice and something far darker. Ethan stumbled back, his mind reeling. The mirror's surface rippled like water, distorting the reflection even further. The figure in the mirror smiled, a cold, lifeless smile that sent a wave of terror through Ethan's entire body. "You may have survived the forest," the reflection continued, its voice low and menacing, "but it will never let you go." The ground beneath Ethan's feet seemed to shift, the air growing colder as the words sank in. He had faced the creature, shattered the mirrors, and freed his brother. But the forest, the ancient, malevolent force that had lured him here, was still there, watching, waiting. It had let him believe he had won, but in truth, it had only released him for a moment. It was still with him, still inside him, And it always would be. The reflection in the mirror began to fade, dissolving into the glass like smoke. But before it vanished completely, it spoke one final time. You belong to the forest now. With that, the mirror shattered, the pieces falling to the ground in a cascade of broken glass. The clearing fell silent once more, and Ethan stood alone, his mind racing, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had just seen. The forest of mirrors was gone, but its darkness had left a mark on him, a scar that would never heal. As he turned to leave, Ethan knew that the forest hadn't truly been defeated. It had let him go, but it would never release its hold on him completely. The terror, the fear, the mystery, it would always be with him, lurking in the shadows of his mind, waiting for the day when it would call him back. And when that day came, Ethan wasn't sure he would be able to resist.